Louise says, I have started to lean towards Buddhism and am drawn by the mindfulness practice and the feeling of peace. I grew up Protestant, as in Baptist, and have been for the last 35 years of my life a Baptist. I just feel like there is a lot of anxiety tied into it and closed-mindedness. I do believe in Jesus and have always felt his presence, but I'm just not sure where everything fits in. Also, there are so many different opinions on what is, quote, right or wrong. I believed in the traditional understanding of marriage. Now it seems like even churches are changing their stances on some very fundamental beliefs. What can I do? Thanks, Luis.
Luis, thank you very much. I really appreciate these questions. So I understand where you're coming from quite a lot, and many of the questions you raise and the experiences you've had are ones that I have had in my own life and led me down some of the same paths that you've gone down in terms of investigation. I would like to give you a little context, though, on this Buddhism business that you're investigating, and then maybe offer a word of explanation and encouragement about your experience of diversity in Christian practice.
Okay.
All right. So first of all, Buddhism as a historical religion means an awful lot more than what you're experiencing as the practice of mindfulness. All right. So there is a movement in the modern secular West to as a therapeutic practice, a kind of clinical practice, to kind of disengage from your conscious, discursive life, your thinking and your anxieties and worries, and to just, sort of non-judgmentally and rather passively let your consciousness sort of adrift and then bring your attention to some object but let go of it. And then in this way to kind of detach from all the worries and anxieties of life. And a fellow named John Kabat-Zinn is very active in promoting this in secular psychology, mindfulness-based stress reduction, this kind of thing. It's all over the place. And you see it on magazine covers and people sitting serenely on yoga mats wearing stretch pants with little potted plants next to them. And yeah, it's calming. I get that. All right. Here's the difficulty. That's not Buddhism. It's not Buddhism at all. But it is a door into Buddhism for many people, right? Because they see it's associated with the Buddhist tradition. But I want you to back up and consider, do you need the whole apparatus of historical Buddhism in order to practice relaxation techniques? All right? And all you got to do is ask the question. You realize, no, I don't need the whole apparatus of Buddhism to practice relaxation techniques. And detaching from your discursive anxieties and worries through a kind of mental discipline is something that is not unique to Buddhism and has been part of the Christian tradition and of non-religious traditions as well. And it's simple logic that if you are taken up with worries and anxieties, then backing up from those worries and anxieties in your thinking is going to have a calming effect.
Sure.
All right. But you don't have to go swallow the whole hog with historic Buddhism to get that effect. And actual Buddhism, right, involves many more commitments than just let me sit on a yoga mat and calm my mind. And for what it's worth, for most Buddhists throughout history, the sit on a yoga mat and calm my mind business is not how they spend their time. And not until the 20th century, and particularly in Burma, did your average Asian Buddhist have anything to do with that. For them, Buddhism primarily meant trying to do good deeds and give alms to Buddhist monks and to perform acts of worship and devotion to Buddhist iconography and statues and so forth in the hopes of generating good karma so they could have a favorable rebirth in another life. All right, so there's a whole structure of belief there that's in the worship of the Buddha as a kind of divine savior character whose grace and merit can come to your aid. Lots of beliefs that are not directly related to this, yoga mat business. All right.
Sure.
So do you need to swallow all that? Well, I think it's ill-advised to go in that direction because you're asked to believe many absurd things if you go and become a card-carrying Buddhist. The first thing you have to do to become a Buddhist is pledge to follow take the triple refuge in the Buddha. Actually, I'm going to take him as my guide and do what he says and believe what he says. Why should you do that? Buddha's not a divine figure, and his claim to illumination and wisdom is highly suspect and easily questionable, because you have to rely in faith that he's had all these clairvoyant experiences and can see into the deep nature of reality. Claims that are entirely unverifiable and largely superstitious. So you don't need to swallow the whole shebang of Buddhism just to have a calming experience and get away from your stresses and anxieties. On the other side of the break, I'm going to make some suggestions about how you can accomplish that as a Christian and how to deal with the problems you raised of Christians disagreeing with Christians.
Talking about leaning towards Buddhism and the practice, which is very hot these days, mindfulness.
Right. So Luis said that he's been practicing mindfulness meditation, and he's been kind of chilling out and feeling calm, and that's making him interested in Buddhism. And so before the break, I was saying, well, look, I got no problem with chilling out and being calm and getting away from your anxieties, and that's a good thing to do, and it's part of the Christian tradition as well. But you don't have to swallow the whole hog and become a Buddhist just because you find it peaceful to get away from your anxious thoughts for a while, right? And there's no logic to that decision. Like you can detach from your anxious thoughts and calm down and take a step back in life without swallowing the whole Buddhist religion that requires that you affirm many things that are contrary to reason and experience. I won't go into a whole, apologetic about Buddhism, but there's a lot of things that Buddhists believe that are not essentially connected to just chilling out on your yoga mat.
Yeah.
Okay. So what to do? Well, simply seeking calmness and peace or escape from sufferings and troubles is not a sufficient philosophy of life. You don't believe me? I'll demonstrate it to you. So, I love my dad. He's a great guy. He provided for his family wonderfully, right? He taught us to go to church. He taught us to treat one another decently. He took care of the poor. He was a man of virtue and good character, right? Sometimes we had hardship and struggle and, family crises, and he'd be there for us, somebody we could turn to. Noble, in other words.
Yes.
My grandfather, same kind of guy. When he died, folks came out of the woodwork and said he was a fine man, a man of enormous integrity, You're the sort of people that would line up in the face of a crisis and take up the mantle of responsibility and protect others. And sometimes that meant willingly enduring a lot of personal suffering in their own lives for the sake of the common good, right? What would I have thought if in the teeth of all this suffering or difficulty or conflict or problems, my dad had said, see you guys, I'm going to my yoga mat. It's not very noble.
No.
Right? And in fact, when Buddhism first went to China, the Confucianists, that was their big indigenous Chinese philosophy. Their big objection to Buddhism is Buddhists are selfish. That was their view, right? The Confucianists, Neo-Confucianists, Buddhists are selfish because they're sitting on the yoga mat. Well, they didn't have yoga mats back then, but basically they're concerned about their own quietude. But there's a world out there to deal with.
Sure.
Right? You got to deal with the world. And so, if you want to live a life that's oriented towards your own personal escape from suffering, well, first of all, good luck.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't actually escape suffering. You can't actually, it's a lie that you can fundamentally escape suffering. And secondly, those aren't really the people we ultimately admire, nor is it really a fully human life, one that says I'm oriented towards inoculating myself against suffering. No, that may be a part of life, but life is about bearing responsibility out of charity for the love of neighbor. Right? And it's kind of despicable, someone who would just withdraw themselves from the responsibility of being alive just to inoculate themselves against suffering.
Well.
Christ doesn't do this, right? And when I look at this mindfulness business and compare that to Jesus, think about Christ's agony in the garden. I mean, this is hardly like the sort of peaceful yoga mat moment for him.
Yeah.
I mean, he is sweating blood in an agony of anticipation. And what is his response to that? Not my will, but thine be done. I will go to the death of martyrdom for the sake of those I love, rather than seek solace in my own meditative quietude, which was an option.
No.
But he didn't do that, right? And that's, of course, far more admirable as a type of human being, the ultimate human being, the God-man, who suffers humiliation, death, and abandonment for the sake of those he loves. Right? That's the kind of life we want to live. And that's what the Christian faith, and particularly the Catholic faith, seeks to offer us. And here is the great mystery, right? That when we surrender ourselves to follow Christ and rely on His grace, and cooperate with His grace and the gifts of the Holy Spirit, that we will nevertheless find that peace that transcends mere meditative quietude, because it is ultimately in union with not the void, not with nothingness, not with the force, not with the Buddha nature, but with the one God of the whole universe, who is the highest good and the infinite source of all goodness itself, in light of which everything else pales in comparison.
Yeah.
And if you read the lives of the saints, you'll see that amidst their trials and sufferings and tribulations that were real, that they didn't escape, nevertheless they found a peace of mind that transcended anything the world had to offer. Now, your experience in the Baptist church, you talk about anxiety and guilt and so forth. I get that. I understand that. My job here is not defending the Baptist church. I left the Baptist church. I left the Presbyterian church for the Catholic tradition, because it was in that tradition that I found a deep tradition of interior life and prayer, meditation and devotion, to help deal with all these conflicts in our inner life that I didn't find that in Presbyterianism, didn't find that in the Baptist church. And we have these resources to make sense of these experiences in light of divine grace, in light of the life of Christ. I'm going to give you some resources that you might consider. One, a program we have on EWTN radio. It's called Divine Intimacy Radio, hosted by Dan Burke and his wife, Stephanie Burke. And it's all about the life of contemplative prayer and the disciplines of prayer. And that means something different to a Catholic than it means to a Baptist. Father Timothy Gallagher, who's been a guest on EWTN many times, and he's got some podcasts, Discerning Hearts podcast, about consolation and desolation in the spiritual life, following the methods of Ignatius of Loyola. All right, another great resource for how do I actually think about my own interior experience and examine it, and even if you want, be mindful of it, right? But in order to conform my life to Christ and to orient myself towards those consolations that lead to God. The books and talks of Father Thomas Dubay, who's also been, he's deceased now, God rest his soul, but he was a frequent contributor to EWTN programming. Excellent on the interior life. And if you really want to dive into the depths, then you can pick up John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, St. Francis de Sales, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine of Hippo. These are the masters of the interior life of the Catholic tradition. Please learn your own tradition before you throw it under the bus and go off after exotic, esoteric Orientalism.
And Luis, thank you for your very thoughtful letter.